What you're about to watch is a compilation of our series through the Defiance Zoo in Tacoma, Washington. One of the smallest, but also one of the most underrated major zoos in the nation. Before I walk you around to see nearly every square inch of this place, I'll start you off with the basics. Defiance is home to over 9,000 animals, representing nearly 370 species, which is actually a lot. But it's only 29 acres, making it the smallest major zoo that I've ever been to. And I went through the entire place in under an hour, and that was with filming, which usually takes a while. Now, sometimes when a zoo is this small, they can be a little on the basic side, but this place was an exception. It may lack a few typical or expected megafauna and expansive enclosures, but it still has the overall feel of a major zoo. To give you an idea, there's a reason why I traveled 2,300 miles to see this place. Admission as of late 2024 is $23 for adults, $21 for seniors, $16 for kids, and infants get in for free. Parking is also free, and I recommend you go into the aardvark lot. And what's really cool is when you scan your ticket successfully, the machine welcomes you with animal noises. The map doesn't show it, but the landscape is basically one large decline from the entrance, so be prepared for that. If you have kids, you'll probably spend a lot of your time at the Kids Zone, one of the more interesting children's zoos that I've been to. It's so wildly wacky, colorful, and random that even the adults will be engaged. If I had to explain it with one photo, all you have to do is look at the lemur exhibit. Seeing that I don't have a kid, I didn't explore much of it myself, and I moved on to one of the most prominent zones. The Tropical Reef Aquarium might be the very first stop of your visit, which I recommend doing that because you might run into shoulder-to-shoulder traffic later in the day. The silver lining, though, is that you might not be in here for long regardless, and neither will we today. The first thing that really caught my eye, it allowed a lot of natural light in compared to other aquariums, which really helped build that tropical feel. Second thing I noticed was the clearly very popular touch tank. Can't really say you have an aquarium if you don't have one of those. Now I wish more aquariums had what became one of my favorite habitats in the zoo, an open-topped stingray beach. Great, we've seen those before. But it was built to be so natural looking, you could say it's practically barrierless. And the only thing that's stopping us from getting our feet wet is a palm tree that's gone sideways. It's filled from an overflow of the lagoon, where the sandy beach slopes into a shallow coral reef. Home to 30 fishes, including 2 varieties of small sharks that I did not spot. I was happy to see that this was open-topped as well. I'll never complain about a backdrop mural, and having the coral come out of the water was a nice touch. And pretty much like all faux coral, they are vibrant and complement the colors of the living and more mobile creatures around it very well. But the depths get even deeper. On the steps is the glistening so-called blue hole, built to mimic a deep-sea cavern where fish and other small critters use for shelter and a place to eat. And this one gives a sneak preview of the outer reef, a 240,000-gallon tank that mimics the outer shelf of a coral reef, the second biggest tank in the zoo. I'm not sure how much of a visual expert on gallon amount you are, but this doesn't really look like 240,000 gallons. But that's because it goes off to the right side where you can't really see a good chunk of it. I'm told by someone who was kind enough to put together a species list, which you can read below, this holds 18 total sharks from 6 different kinds. That's a lot of teeth, and I believe it's the most I've ever seen in one space. As if that didn't make this tank amazing on its own, you can actually pay to be on the other side of these windows. Defiance is one of the few animal institutions to offer shark cage dives for $115 for non-members, which includes zoo admission and a souvenir video of your 20-minute in-water experience. If that sounds like your kind of adventure, there's a link to the encounter in the comments. So this is where our time touring the Tropical Reef Aquarium will end, even though it's not the last display. These are, but they were closed at the time. When you reach the surface, it'll push you towards the most immersive and often most peaceful part of the zoo, which takes up approximately 4.5 of the park's 29 acres. This area opened in 2004, highlighting tropical regions from Southeast Asia, and the very first signage gives you a rundown of the exhibit itself and previews what's now an outdated list of the animals that you could see, and it won't be too long before you reach the first of 7 habitats. Most of them can be described as average, but they are part of a very complex system, and it's best if I show you from above. 5 of the 7 living spaces can rotate multiple species on a scheduled basis, something I imagine just had to be inspired by the Louisville Zoo's Islands complex that does the same thing with 4 enclosures and even some of the same animals. Despite what the sign out front will tell you though, this sanctuary currently has 8 species and 7 of them rotate. The first ones that gave me any sort of movement were the Siamang gibbons, a member of the lesser ape family. Even with the identification signs scattered around the trail, I struggled for a second to figure out who these were, since I'm used to seeing gibbons off the ground like this, when all I could make out were 2 black fur balls in the grass. Not to sound like a spoiled kid that didn't get what they wanted, I didn't exactly get the ideal rotation that I was hoping for. If I had to make a list, the endangered lowland anoa would be at the very top. It's always a pleasure to be in the presence of a species that makes you go, what is that? Even if you do read their signage. If you didn't know any better, you might guess that this is a baby water buffalo. Baby being here is fully grown. Anoas are the world's smallest kind of buffalo and the world's smallest kind of wild cattle. If you do find her all alone, don't worry, that's just in their nature. However, the zoo will occasionally mix her with the Siamangs and the white-handed gibbons to keep her some not-so-quiet company. Whether the design was intentional or not, this is where I started to really see more similarities between most of this sanctuary's habitats and the ones in Louisville's islands. They're not big, they're meshed, slightly detailed, and they both have a public day room. Except in Washington, you can see the animals walk inside and out. And this one even connects to another enclosure, but we'll come back to that soon. In the middle of this forest, literally in the middle of all this mix-up madness, is the first open-top display that's a little heavier and louder on the aquatics, so I expected to see the otters and got a Malayan tapir. Regardless, it was nice to see the zoo use a glass barrier. Not once, but twice when you include the backside of the enclosure. I know a lot of photographers are not big fans of glass, but this is one of the few chances life will give you to get within centimeters of this amazing relative of the rhino. Sadly, they did not share my enthusiasm. No encounter with a tapir? Fine by me. I'll just get my close-ups with one of the few things that can eat them. A very active Sumatran tiger, busy spraying and rubbing their own scent. And this is one reason why I love the idea of rotating animals. Not only do the inhabitants get a different view or setting every day, they can also pick up each other's smells, which I know a lot of zoos use as enrichment. This third display that we just skipped earlier also has double-sided acrylic viewing with mesh on the sides, so whoever is in here can technically see a piece of every living space that's part of the rotation, including the largest one in the rotation and the most detailed, terrained, and just all around the best part of the sanctuary, and the third best in the entire zoo in my opinion, with the red wolf being number 1 and muskox being number 2. From my own experience, even the best tiger exhibits don't hide the cats this well, and all of the open space provided a fascinating daily keeper chat. You can learn about the tigers in the wild, at the zoo and their successful breeding program, along with a feeding, which finally allowed me to scratch off "Tiger catches food mid-air" off my shot list. Now that we've covered all 5 of the utility displays, I just wanted to give a quick breakdown of what animals you could see in each habitat based on old photos and common sense. All 7 species, including a hornbill, there was one sign for a wrinkled hornbill, can access the 3 enclosed spaces. You can find the big cats in these 4, otherwise if they were where the tapir was, it probably wouldn't go so well. But the only species that don't have the hops, like the anoa, tapir, and otters, have the option to be in all 5 spaces. I also feel the need to mention the theming. It's very subtle but effective. The signage outside of the identifications is one of my favorite sets that I've ever seen. We really need to go back to colored pencil sketches and watercolors. The other objects represent cultural symbols, conservation messages, and that includes the illegal wildlife trade. The real gut puncher came from the tape recorder. I didn't really capture it well enough, but it's actually supposed to be a recording of what sounds like a forest being destroyed and human civilization taking over. and the sign next to it pretty much confirms my guess. As the footpath starts to make its way towards the exit, you'll pass the other side of the middle display where the tapir was, and the other side of where the siamangs were, and eventually meet the cats of the canopy, a 2011 edition, 7 years after the sanctuary opened, and it was a very welcoming addition indeed. $1 million well spent. It's home to clouded leopards, the only species around here that isn't classified as endangered. They still are threatened and classified as vulnerable to extinction. It's one of those exhibits that's so good and does its job so well that it's not easy to see the animals when they're in the main exhibit, which is, or apparently was, the tallest clouded leopard display in the United States. Before my visit, I was actually told I might not see them, but fortunately they have a fairly standard day room where it was impossible for me to miss them. It's been quite the journey so far, but we will have to end it on a sad note, and I'm afraid that I won't be able to give this moment justice, so bear with me if you're a local. Just a few days before my visit, the Point Defiance Zoo said goodbye to their largest, oldest, and what they called their most beloved resident, Suki, their Asian elephant, who was a former circus performer that called Tacoma home for nearly 3 decades and almost lived to be 60 years old, making her one of the oldest of her kind in the country. I didn't even talk to anyone about her, but I could feel how loved she was. The flowers and even the tears that I saw showed that she will be remembered for a very long time. No one publicly knows what will happen to her home just yet, but as others have pointed out for actually over a decade now, I can't help agree that it would make a great space for Indian rhinos to keep the conservation and Asian theme going. So, fingers crossed. We'll be taking a left into the Discovery Hut behind the aquarium. It's what I would call the zoo's main pit stop. You can eat and use the restroom, and while you're all charged up or charging up, this station also provides close animal encounters. But rather than the keepers holding the animals to let you pet them, the keepers let them roam around as much as they can, although some care to move more than others. They're kind of easy to miss if you ask me, but the sheltered part of the area shelters a barn owl that I didn't expect to see, and there's even a wonderful terrarium for a rhinoceros iguana, one of the few reptiles actually on display at the zoo. If you go to this area from the other side, you'll run into the tide pool, or what used to be a tide pool. It's now been drained. From my understanding, I guess the idea is that the pools were filled from the runoff in the old aquarium that's right behind this. Something that I'll get to in a second. But no matter which way you go, you cannot miss the Penguin Point. Not just because it would be wrong to miss out on some penguins, you'll physically be drawn towards this. The Penguin Point opened up in 1989, and it kind of holds up as one of the most natural looking penguin habitats I've ever seen. If some of you are wondering why there's no ice or winter wonderland, these are Magellanic penguins, and their enclosure reflects the rocky beaches of South America's southern coasts, which is a little warmer than the climate around the South Pole. Many of you know that zoo penguins can be identified from the bands on their wings. From what I saw, you could not identify them at the zoo itself. But if you go to their website in the Penguin Point section and scroll around, every single penguin has a bio with their hatch date, reason for their name, and their personality. Unless I have a chance of getting splashed, I don't usually go to presentations, but I knew I had a lot of spare time and watched most of the live show at the Wild Wonders Theater. We were nearing Halloween, so the show was about, I think, a zookeeper meets a sorcerer who magically summons animals. I don't know. At least the kids looked like they knew what was going on. Whatever it was, props to them for being different while still staying educational. And if you can make me laugh, then it's probably a good show. Although I do laugh at everything. Just go see it for yourself. So, you'd be lucky enough to see one aquarium in a zoo, but Point Defiance famously has 2. In order to properly introduce you to the Pacific Seas Aquarium, I need to go back to the tropical one real quick. If you were to Google the Tropical Reef Aquarium, you'll most likely get articles talking about the 2024 grand reopening after a $7 million restoration. The habitats themselves received minor touch-ups, but the real upgrades were behind the scenes. This 15,000 square foot complex opened in 1989, labeled as the South Pacific Aquarium. and it's connected to the once beloved North Pacific Aquarium that opened in 1963. South Pacific got a name change and a facelift. North Pacific closed in 2018, but that same year, the theme was survived and moved to the $52 million, 35,000 square foot Pacific Seas Aquarium. With about 400,000 gallons, it's dedicated to life in Puget Sound that's just beyond the zoo's border, all the way down to the warm depths of the Gulf of California. Your first encounter with the Pacific Seas is actually outside, the thing that made these concrete walls a little prettier. A 4,500-gallon tidal surge tank with sea stars, anemones, salmon, kelp, and algae. Every minute or so, a flood or surge of bubbly white foam crashes through the tank, representing how waves and tides bring fresh nutrients to animals in the area. As soon as you enter in the building, you'll actually face the grandest tank in the entire zoo. But since this is also the finale, we will just ignore that for now. The upper gallery continues with a couple of Pacific Seas classics, a staple to aquariums if you ask me. Japanese spider crabs, the largest existing arthropod in the world. They prefer the seabed by vents and holes that are 2,000 feet below the surface. Over here we have what's called a schooling fish tank, with a school of Pacific herring, showing their loyalty to moving around in this endless circle. It's not quite as full as the similar mackerel tank at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, but maybe one day, this school will grow into the fish NATO every schooling fish dreams of creating. If you were paying attention to the tropical reef segments, you saw that aquariums can get hectic. But jelly galleries are the cure for drowning out all the noise. There's just something so calming about watching these gelatinous creatures floating aimlessly. Whether it's against an empty blue backdrop or a color-changing globe. Although if you're more flat like the upside down jelly, you won't be doing a lot of floating. We actually learned on another episode they do this because algae lives in their tissue, and by lying upside down, they're exposing the algae to the sun, allowing it to photosynthesize, and in turn the jelly will live off of the algae's byproducts. The pathway in beautiful fashion will descend us even further into the spotlight on the sound gallery. What sound? The Puget Sound, of course. There are 9 total tanks with over 60 species. Everything on the right side features creatures that can be really tough to find. I'm talking about both in the wild and even in here. Some are just that small. Others make you question whether or not you're looking at a real living organism. And then you have ones that are just really good at hiding. I promise one of these days an octopus will make it on this channel. So like all Pacific-themed aquariums, eventually you're going to run into a lot of kelp. They really love that stuff up here. The coastal kelp forest replicates the California coast. According to the map, I was promised leopard sharks, but ended up seeing something even better. The California sheephead is a colorful, clearly intelligent-looking wrasse. They sport a very strong chin and canine teeth that can crush urchins, crabs, and other shellfish. Apparently, this is Buddy, who lived in the old aquarium and has been a fan favorite for years. What was also a fan favorite, the Northwest Waters, 100,000 gallons, full of stunning wildlife sheltered under a pier. Just in case you ever wanted to know what it looks like under one of these in the Pacific Northwest. Complete with barnacle-encrusted pillings, 400 total sea anemones that have to be individually hand-fed, along with 15 other species behind a 25-foot wide, 10-foot tall window. Even though I was able to get up close to the one in the tropical aquarium, I didn't personally take part in the opportunity to pet anything over here. But just letting you know that your family's favorite might be the tidal touch zone where you can get hands-on with sea stars, crabs, and a lot more. And then around the corner is the final descent that reveals the Pacific Seas ends exactly how it begins. This is the Baja Bay, both the last thing that you see and the very first thing that you see when you walk right into the building. Some sources say that it's either 250,000 gallons, others say it's 280,000 gallons. Whatever, it's still the largest aquatic display in the entire zoo and offers a breathtaking view. Why have full tunnel when half tunnel do trick? The blue balmy waters replicates the subtropics of Baja California, According to the zoo site, there's one Atlantic green sea turtle from the Omaha Zoo, so there's a good chance that we've seen them before, along with 2 Pacific green sea turtles that actually hatched at SeaWorld San Diego in 2003. There's 4 gorgeous and endangered white-spotted eagle rays. And before you get your hopes up if you're planning on making a visit anytime soon, obviously hammerheads are the buildings or one of the zoo's star attractions, but I'll just put it lightly that they are no longer here. The Rocky Shores opened in 1982, and other than a small 2017 renovation, from what I've seen from old photos, it hasn't changed much, and I don't mean that in a bad way. What you're about to see is a collection of 4 mammals and 3 kinds of birds that live up and down North America's Pacific coastline in 4 different habitats. Starting with the Pacific walruses, a Point Defiance icon since these shores opened, as evidenced by the statue that's dedicated to E.T. at the zoo's entrance, a walrus that debuted with the exhibit in the 80s. This is gonna sound a little silly, but I was really nervous when I came over here. I mean, it's not like I haven't seen Andy Reid's kind before, but to exaggerate, it's almost a miracle that Belzic and Lakina are here, because once you lose walruses, in this case lose a pair to breeding recommendations like the zoo did in 2020, it's almost impossible to get the species back. Fortunately, as their keeper put it, the aquarium in Quebec that took care of them, quote unquote, didn't want to take care of them anymore. So thankfully, the half-siblings moved to Washington in late 2022. And what's really cool is they understand training commands in both English and French. We all know what a walrus is. They're a fairly famous animal, but they're also one of the rarest zoo animals. As of 2024, only 4 places in America host this giant pinniped. So if you're in the US and want to see a walrus, get to any one of these reputable locations before it's too late. For maximum viewing opportunities, I recommend right here, because it's the only one that doesn't make you watch them through glass. That is if you don't count SeaWorld Orlando's show. Netting isn't exactly ideal either, but they're also not picky eaters, and you can't trust visitors to hold on to their phones, maps, children, so I get it. Safety first. That'll take us from Alaskan waters to the mainland US's west coast. But I want us to put a bookmark on this exhibit for now because we will be back. That won't be the only time we do that. I really hate to do it, but it's for a good reason. Purely for editing purposes, actually. So take in what you can of the pretty birds for now because we'll come back to them. The lower level of the Rocky Shores was one of the highlights throughout my entire visit, even if the underwater view to the walruses was blocked off at the time. I really tried to emphasize that a good exhibit needs good education, and this is the, I guess you could say, best mini museum I've ever seen. Skeletal features, beautiful murals, regular signage with actual animal parts next to actual animals. What you're looking at is the pool that we skipped above, home to California sea lions and harbor seals. Their exhibit just doesn't look like it was built for pinnipeds, other than the small amphitheater that was added later. That one makes sense. Which, by the way, I did actually make it over here for the keeper chat, expecting to see some sort of presentation, obviously. All we got was a keeper pushing a plastic float with the hose, which I guess was pretty entertaining too. Anyways, the pool is deeper than what I'm used to seeing. There's not a whole lot of land area, and though it's not unique, there's not a lot of sea lion exhibits that use glass for above ground level barriers. To get to the point, it doesn't look like it was built for them because originally it was built for belugas, one of the last species you'd ever expect to find in a zoo. In fact, I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this was the last traditional zoo in America that had belugas. The zoo housed a total of 10 of these bulbous-headed whales from the mid-80s to 2009. Not at the same time, of course. And one of them, who some of you might know, was Beethoven, who should be on the Shed Aquarium episode in the corner of your screen. This was obviously a smart change. The belugas needed more space, and sea lions in this area are always in the need for rescuing. I just wish, though, that they kept the natural look of the exhibit. Oh well. Going down below, there's a 4th underwater viewing, but guess what? So I've been wanting to make a short, or a long video, whatever, on animals that usually receive subpar exhibits from my own experience. Well, near the top of that list would be seabirds that are not penguins, just to be specific. They're usually cramped, behind glass that needs a squeegee, they're inside and don't have any natural substrate. So this was really wonderful to see. I think this was the first time I've ever seen anything like this for puffins and the common murre. It has multiple layers. You got the underwater viewing, ground level view of course that lets you get super close to the birds, and a sea cliff with grass and nesting burrows. And the best part is that it's in the great outdoors, and obviously since they are cold tolerant, the birds can be outside all year round. The last stop, you guys are gonna like this. The best way to end any exhibit is with sea otters. Can we just take a moment to appreciate how great this lineup of animals is? There really isn't anything like it. Speaking of rescues, Point Defiance's sea otters were given a second chance after life in the wild didn't treat them so well. Some were abandoned by their mothers, rehabilitated from oil spills, and I believe most of them are deemed unreleasable by the US Fish and Wildlife Service. I've been wanting to bring something up for a while, because I hear the comments in person, I see them online, and maybe even some of you wonder, why does nearly every sea otter exhibit have very little land versus other otter exhibits? And here's an example. As we saw in our time at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, you can find them at most within a mile of the shore, but they can live exclusively in the ocean. They'll just float like this together in the hundreds and even the thousands. They eat, sleep, and even raise pups while they act like a raft on the surface. But they might come to land to avoid a storm or predator every now and then. Oh, and as you can see right here, they really just don't move as gracefully on land as they do at sea. The unforgiving tundra. The actual one, not this one. One of the driest places on Earth, with frost-molded landscapes, little precipitation, poor nutrients, and short seasons. However, it is, most of the time, the perfect paradise for polar bears. So right off the bat, I'll point out that Point Defiance doesn't have the most modern-looking habitat, but it's kind of special for a couple of reasons. This was awarded the AZA Exhibit Award in 1982. This is an example of another award-winning polar bear exhibit in Detroit that opened in the early 2000s, which overall is 8 times bigger. So for context, up until, sadly, relatively recently, it was common to put ice bears in the pit of doom. So when a zoo goes from this to this over 40 years ago, it definitely turned some heads. In fact, I hear that the director of the nearby Woodland Park Zoo at the time said that this was one of the best and most inspirational exhibits in the world. On our last adventure, I casually mentioned that it's a miracle that the zoo still has walruses. Well, I could pretty much say the same thing about their polar bears. They're not easy to breed and are starting to become in short supply themselves. When their last bear passed in 2022, the zoo community was a little worried that Point Defiance wouldn't find any more after caring for polar bears for 80 years. But actually, we had nothing to worry about, because twin sisters Astra and Lerke moved to Washington from Detroit in 2023. And hopefully for many more years to come, you will be able to see not just an amazing animal up close, but also the zoo's icon. Speaking of Detroit, one last time, I noticed the surroundings of Point Defiance's Arctic tundra are similar to the Detroit Zoo's Arctic Ring of Life. Both pathways are fenced in by mounds on both sides of you, and does a great job at hiding and blending the unnatural elements around them. The pathway on the Ring of Life features a shelter made of whale and other Inuit structures. The tundra's pathway features multiple games to keep the kids occupied in between exhibits. Unlike Detroit though, this zoo did not phase out their Arctic foxes. This is Fen and Freya. If you visit them during warmer weather, their fur should be gray. Visit them when it's colder and their coat should be as white as snow. Or when it's mild out, you might see them like this. Arctic foxes are often naturally found in the treeless taiga of Arctic Eurasia and North America, and sometimes people's homes, apparently. Before Sven came to Tacoma, he came from a rescue and rehabilitation center, and before that, in private care in Oklahoma, where it is illegal to own an Arctic fox. Okay, I still can't get it out of my head either. If you're still wondering how this won an exhibit award, I should have shown you earlier that it didn't have all that extra fencing, because without it, you would be able to see more clearly there are two very large exhibits in the distance behind it, creating the illusion that predator and prey share the same space. Back in the day, I think that one that we just saw displayed reindeer. Now, both of these beautiful hills are home to the channel's very first and possibly the very last Umi Mak, which basically translates to the animal with skin like a beard, also known as the muskox, shaggy survivors of the Ice Age. Despite their name, they are actually more closely related to sheep and goats than they are to actual oxen. Their genus name actually means sheep ox. Now, please do not judge me, or go ahead, because it's kind of funny. There's a reason why I asked you that question at the beginning. I don't know or didn't know anything about the growth and development of muskoxen, so when I hear that they had a baby a year before my visit, I thought that this was the baby. Because, you know, some animals grow pretty fast. This is Hudson, a full-grown bull that weighs about 750 pounds. Turns out, I just thought muskoxen would be bigger. Apparently, males only grow about 5 feet tall at the shoulder, females are a little smaller. I guess I expected them to be like bison-sized, which is at least another foot or two taller. Now, this is the calf. In 2023, Hudson and Charlotte gave us Willow, named after her parents' favorite food. In case you don't make zoos your personality and are a little out of the loop, her birth was a huge deal. From what I've heard, muskoxen are not easy to take care of. Imagine having fur that's all over your body, but now imagine that it has 2 layers and a lot of it is over 3 feet long, the longest and one of the warmest fur of any animal. So naturally, heat is their enemy, that and wolves. According to the Minnesota Zoo, which we'll actually see pretty soon, they had to phase the species out because the state has become too warm for them, leaving Point Defiance with the last remaining zoo in the mainland US with this beautiful bovid. But it gets better. The zoo has reported that Willow has been weaned, but is still too small to be around Hudson. However, this is a social species and he can't be alone forever. So while Charlotte goes back and forth between her mate and her baby, a few weeks ago, the Arctic tundra welcomed Pretzel from a research facility in Alaska to be Willow's companion. And the plan is to eventually have all 4 muskoxen share the same space. I haven't really done it on this series so far, but every now and then I'll talk about a zoo's conservation work so you know what you're supporting when you visit. We saw on the last episode that Point Defiance is one of several places that plays refuge to rescued sea otters and sea lions. They also run a society called the Dr. Holly Reed Wildlife Conservation Fund that's provided millions of dollars in grants to projects that work to save sea turtles, polar bears, and several gems from Southeast Asia. However, you can actually see the conservation work being done at the Red Wolf Woods, one of the greatest conservation-focused projects I have ever seen, and I don't know where to begin. From the plethora of signage that shows off the wolf's anatomy, other wild canids' anatomy, tracking equipment, and where they used to live in the past. Then you have the timeline of the zoo's conservation work with the species, which I'll get into in a second, to not 1, but 2 gorgeous enclosures, the best in the zoo in my opinion. All of this opened in 2010, but the zoo has worked with the species since the 70s. Before Europeans came over, they covered ground from New York to Texas. But by the 70s, there were only 14 or 17, depending on who you ask, pure red wolves left in the wild. And it was the Point Defiant Zoo that rounded them up and began a breeding program, what would later become an award-winning breeding program. While several wolves have been released back into the North Carolina woods over the years, they still interbreed with coyotes, and hunters still mistake them for coyotes, and the latest reports from the Wolf Conservation Center say only 16 remain in the wild. On a positive note though, the zoo says there are 270 red wolves in human care in 50 institutions, and nearly 50 of them live at the zoo's own off-site breeding facility. And they still are determined to prepare a lot of them for life on their own to boost up their numbers in the wild. Now as for what to do when you walk out, the zoo is just a small part of the 760-acre Point Defiance park that touches the Puget Sound. You can take a hike, marvel at or use one of the famous ferry boats, explore the beach and hope to see killer whales, and definitely bring your larger camera for Mount Rainier in the distance. After walking around the zoo 6 times, I was a little tired to do much else. So I drove 5 minutes to the waterfront where I found Anthony's. I had a lovely view of the water, met 2 lovely bartenders, and had one of the best meals of my life. And that was my breakdown of Tacoma's Point Defiance Zoo. Again, it's small and you might not be here for very long, but like I said earlier, it has all the personality and a lot of amazing animals that you'd find at a major zoo. And of course, some that you wouldn't find. Also, as you saw, the nature around us is gorgeous. And on another note, I need to give the zoo credit for being very clear on when and where their animal encounters are. Not every zoo is good at communicating those. When I put it up against the 53 other attractions that I've been to, I would place it around the 32-ish mark, and the 29 mark if I'm talking about just zoos. That makes it sound like I didn't enjoy myself. Do not let that number discourage you from coming here. It's just that the higher ranked places in front of it have a lot more to offer. I actually loved this place. It's the perfect zoo for everyone. Families, speciesless hunters, people who don't like walking that much, everyone. If you're in the area though and have time for only one zoo, go to the Woodland Park Zoo. But if you have time to spare, I very much encourage you to make time for the Point Defiance Zoo. Now before we close out, if there are any locals out there watching this, let me know what I missed. And as for everyone, please stay tuned for the next episode. Stay wild, and thank you all for watching Zoo Tours.